Well, hey friends, Wayne Gautney here with Stetson Baptist Church. Welcome to Drawing Closer to God, Season 4. We're going to start a whole new series, and I'm so glad that you could join us tonight. I am actually down in DeBerry, Florida at Gemini Springs Park. And so before we jump into our Bible study tonight, thought I would take you on a little tour of the beautiful surroundings. I always love to get outside and enjoy God's creation, so come along with me. Well, nothing makes me feel like I'm in Florida more than being surrounded by palmettos, palm trees, and these oaks with the Spanish moss. It's just amazing. This is one of the two boils here at Gemini Springs. Obviously, with a name like Gemini, you know there's got to be two, right? So we'll take a look at the next one here in a minute. And here is the other spring. The spring water in Florida is 72 degrees all year round. That's why in the wintertime, the manatees like to get up in the springs because it's a lot warmer than that 30 and 40 degree water. Well, let's get to our lesson for tonight. We're looking in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 25, and what we find there is David, King David. This is before he becomes king. So let me just sort of set up the story for where we are. At this point, David has been brought into Saul's household. This is after David played the harp for Saul, and Saul threw the javelins at David because of his jealousy. This is after Saul chased David into the wilderness the first time, where Saul went into a cave and David's men were in there. He didn't realize it. God had really given David the perfect opportunity to end Saul's life at that point, and he chose not to, saying that Saul was king because God had anointed him to be king, and so he refused to take Saul's life. But he cut part of Saul's robe off, and at that point he holds it up for Saul to see, and he says, basically, I had the opportunity to kill you, but I didn't. And Saul temporarily forgave David, and so at this point they're no longer running through the wilderness chasing one another, and Saul has gone back to Jerusalem. David is now 600 men strong, 600 soldiers that are loyal to him, and they have been hiding out in the Paran wilderness. It's a desert area. It's sort of that Sinai Peninsula area, very near Kadesh Barnea, which you hear about a lot when the children of Israel came out of Egypt. They were there several times. And while they were there, they were in this countryside. There was a wealthy landowner with a lot of sheep and goats. His name was Nabal. The name Nabal literally means fool. So I don't know what his mama was thinking, but that's the name he had. Maybe he acquired it later in life because it really fit his personality. David and his men are out in the wilderness. These shepherds are all around them. These are shepherds that are serving Nabal. They're watching over his flocks. He is an extremely wealthy man. And they are protecting them. David and his men are protecting these shepherds. No harm comes to them. The shepherds are safe under the protection of David. None of David's men demand or take anything from the shepherds. They leave them alone. They allow them to go about their business. And of course, at that time, it was very dangerous to be out in the wilderness because there were opportunities for robbers and thieves to come down upon you, take all that you have. And so there was no real police force, but David was acting as a police force for Nabal. And so after some time, I'm not sure how long, but maybe several weeks at least, David and his men are ready to celebrate a feast. Now usually the sheep are sheared in the springtime of the year so that they'll have time to grow their coats back for the winter. And so at this time, it could have been a feast, one of the Jewish feasts like Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We're not really sure. The Bible doesn't say. It also could have been a feast time as these shepherds would shear the sheep of their wool. And so it's sort of like harvest time in the fall, but this is a springtime event. And whatever feast it was, David wanted to celebrate with his men and have some time of rest. And so he sends 10 of his men, these young men, to Nabal, to his household, and asks for some food, water, and so forth for his men to celebrate the feast. So these 10 men sent from David to Nabal finally meet up with Nabal. And at this point, Nabal is heavily involved in his feast. It's a very lavish feast. And the Bible describes it as the kind of feast that a king would serve. And so it tells you the kind of wealth that Nabal had. And David's request was very modest, but it was met with not the right attitude. Nabal refused to give the young men what they requested, and he even insulted David and says, "Who is this David, and who is the son of Jesse?" Now, we know at this point, at this time in Israel, David's name was becoming quite popular, and his fame was widespread around Israel. And so for Nabal to say this is very much an insult, because David was quite well known among the people at this point. They go back, they return to David with this message from Nabal that he has refused his request. And David becomes very angry. He is very insulted and slighted by this. And he tells his men to strap on their swords, and they do. So this is 400 men at this point. 200 of them stay behind to watch over all of their belongings. And 400 of the 600 men strap on their swords, and they follow David to the house of Nabal. Now, in the meantime, one of Nabal's servants goes to his wife Abigail. Now, Abigail hears the word. She was not there when the 10 messengers came originally. And so she was out of the loop on what was going on. They tell her what happened, and so she immediately flies into action. She starts preparing loaves of bread, raisin cakes, and all sorts of goodies, and gets these all together, hundreds of them. And she sends them on with her servants. She said, "Go ahead of me to David. Present these gifts to him. This is what you're to say to him. Please forgive our rudeness." I'm translating. "Please forgive our rudeness. Please accept these gifts. We are your humble servants," and so forth. And so the servants went on ahead. They met David and his men. They presented the gifts. And then shortly after that, Abigail comes up on a donkey. She stops when David's men come down to meet her, and she gets down on her knees, and she begins to implore David, please understand that my master, Nabal, my husband, is a mean man. He's very harsh in his dealings. So Nabal's reputation is not great, and it's well known throughout the area. And so she chooses wisely here to really humble herself and appeal to David not to follow through with what he had planned. And so David does. He accepts her gifts. He accepts the apology that she offers. And he relents from this mad rush to basically destroy Nabal and all of his male servants and sons. And through all of this, Abigail is the one who we focus on here. And I think it's really important to see that. Now, Abigail averts disaster. And she goes to Nabal, her husband. But at this point in the day, again, he's feasting. He is too drunk for her to talk to him at this point. So she waits until the next day, and she approaches him, and she explains what happened now that he is sober. And the Bible says that his heart became like stone. He was so terrified at what he heard, and the fact that disaster was barely averted here because of his foolishness. And the Bible says, oddly enough, that 10 days later, Nabal died. I don't know if that was a judgment on him by God or what happened there, but he died. Now, I'm sure in the process of this appeal and what Abigail did, she really impressed David with the way she handled the situation. And so the Bible tells us that after Nabal passed away, after some time, David sends for Abigail, to come to the palace and to become one of his wives. And so, of course, in those days, if you're a widow, it can be very taxing on you. And he wanted to make sure she was taken care of. I think he really was impressed with Abigail and her peacemaking skills. So, what can we learn from this obscure passage in the Old Testament? I think the thing that stood out to me the most was Abigail. And when we see this woman and her discernment, she understood the situation. She processed everything very quickly and moved into action. She knew what she had to do to protect her family and to bring peace. And so here you had two men, Nabal and David, both very prideful men. Nabal in a foolish way, David maybe justified in the fact that he was a very important person in Israel. And so here he had been disrespected and even just rudely treated after he had done so much to protect Nabal and his shepherds and flocks. And he was just looking for something small in return and got refused. And he was ready to end Nabal's life along with his sons and male servants and just basically wipe out the whole household over this matter. So probably not a good thing on David's part either. And here we have two men who are letting their ego go to their head. And thankfully you had someone like Abigail who understood what it meant to be submissive and to be respectful. I love Proverbs 15:1 where it says a soft answer turns away wrath. And so what we had here was a situation where Abigail really diffused a bad situation by understanding what was at stake and what she had to do. And so it's a beautiful thing that we see. Two foolish men acting rashly, and here this woman comes in and graciously appeals to David in a way that he responds to, and he recognizes the wisdom of what she's saying, and he relents from his plans to kill Nabal. So how do we apply this in our lives today? And I would say probably it's important for us to learn the idea of how to make an appeal, how to go into a situation that's highly toxic, and finding ways to gain some common ground and to gracefully bring peace into a harsh situation. Could things have still gone bad despite Abigail's efforts? Yes. We can't control how other people respond, but she did everything that she could do in her power to be one who was showing submission and love and respect toward David. And his response was he listened, and his anger went away, and all of that subsided, and he not only forgave Nabal, but here he remembers to take care of Abigail in her widowhood and brings her into the royal palace to be one of his wives, to take care of her for the rest of her life. So really neat story, and I hope you enjoyed it. Dig into 1 Samuel a little bit more this week. It's a roller coaster ride when you start looking at the life of David. All right, here's that drawing, and I'll see you next week on Drawing Closer to God.